I'm George Gallow, and I present كلمة on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, for Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing matters of grave importance worldwide. We have gathered together an audience of distinguished experts and one or two gifted amateurs like me. The question that we're discussing tonight is ISIS and the fight back against it. The world is officially at war. We'll be discussing whether we really are at war or not. Saudi Arabia has announced that it's at the head of a 34-country military alliance based in Riyadh against terrorism, all kinds of terrorism, apparently. Saudi Arabia is the head of, separately, a different coalition which is currently bombarding Yemen at very great civilian expense. NATO is at war and has been for well over a year in Iraq and Syria. Britain has just joined the military bombardment of Syria, having been forced to abandon that idea just a couple of years ago in a parliamentary debate in which I featured. All kinds of people say they're at war with extremism, say they're at war with terrorism, say they're at war with ISIS, though some are at war with ISIS but not Al-Qaeda. Some are at war with ISIS and Al-Qaeda but not other Takfiri fanatic organizations. There's a war raging in northern Nigeria where atrocities abound. There's a war in Libya which follows on from the previous war that NATO had been involved in, the regime change of the Gaddafi dictatorship there. Now ISIS are in charge of those parts of Libya that Al-Qaeda are not in charge of, or other extremist organizations. In other words, we're in a very serious problem. Because if we are all at war, the wars ain't working. ISIS, which grew out of Al-Qaeda, which was once a few hundred people in the caves of the Tora Bora in Afghanistan, would appear now to have a worldwide reach. The mass media talks of little else. They're not really clear what they're talking about, but the word ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, Islamic State is on everybody's lips. Donald Trump is charging towards the Republican Party's presidential nomination, exploiting the fear and loathing that has arisen from this period. 1,150,000 Americans have been shot to death in their country since 1980. 99% of the shooters were not Muslims. You have more chance of dying in your bath from drowning in the United States than you do of dying in a terrorist attack. But nobody is terrified of getting into the bath. And nobody appears very terrified about the fact that you can buy guns in America over the counter, whoever you are. But they're all terrified of terrorism, they're all terrified of Muslims, and people are making a very handsome political living out of exploiting those fears. So we're going to be discussing tonight, who is ISIS? What is Al-Qaeda? Who is really fighting them? And how are we going to defeat them? As I said, I have an audience of great expertise and one or two amateurs, of which I am one. Let's throw to the audience for the first contribution. Madam.
Hello, good evening. My name is Leisha Hayes and I'm an academic and journalist, and my area of interest is how the media can frame and in many cases worsen and deepen a conflict by how they report it. in my research, journalistic and academic, into the conflicts in Northern Ireland and Kosovo, certainly that's what I have found. But would you, in the context of ISIS, with their huge propaganda machine and atrocities that they want the Western media to cover, are there any other narratives that could be publicised and get a media airing that aren't being, for example, looking at the context of the conflict, the history, the ideology, the structure, the culture, who the various parties are who have a stake in this conflict? And do you feel that could perhaps help solve this conflict?
Well, thank you for your contribution and your question. I myself think there's nothing huge about ISIS. I don't think they have a huge propaganda machine. They've got some guys on Twitter, got some guys on Facebook and on the internet. They don't have a television station, they don't have a radio station, they don't have newspapers, they don't have magazines. There's nothing huge about them. Indeed, it's my case that if those who say they're fighting ISIS were really fighting them, there would now be no ISIS. If Saudi Arabia was really leading 34, that's a big alliance, 34 countries headquartered in Riyadh and using full spectrum approaches to dealing with them, they'd already be gone. It's because they aren't that they're not gone. It's because so much of this is smoke and mirrors that they're not gone. Saudi Arabia isn't fighting ISIS, it's funding ISIS. Many people in Saudi Arabia are sending millions of dollars to ISIS, as they sent tens, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars to Al-Qaeda, the mothership of ISIS. Saudi Arabia has been bombarding Yemen, the poorest country in the Arab world, for months, killing thousands of people, most of them civilians, at the head of a quite separate coalition that it says it has created, and with British and American collusion. Britain and France and America are directly or indirectly, wittingly and unwittingly, supporting all of these extremist organizations. Otherwise, how could they be operating? Our NATO ally, Turkey, is bombing the Kurdish militias that are fighting ISIS in Syria. The United States is dropping weapons which somehow miraculously end up in the hands of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Even where they don't mean to, they are giving weapons and money and so-called non-lethal aid to the so-called free so-called Syrian army, FSA, which is promptly taken by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And this must be known by the people who are giving the weapons and the money in the first place. I'll tell you my view. The only people who are fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda are the governments of Iraq and Syria and their respective armies and the allies of those two governments. The rest is moonshine at best and deliberate confusion, obfuscation, disinformation at worst. So, is the media narrative accurate? It is fantastically inaccurate. But, I say with all respect to you as a journalist, and we may disagree on this, I believe it is deliberately so, not accidentally so. For example, the British media marched us into joining the war on Syria as if it were the same war that Russia and Iran and Hezbollah and the Syrian Arab army are fighting. It's not. It's a completely different war. Russia and Iran and other allies of Syria are really fighting ISIS and have been for 5 years at fantastic cost. Britain and France and America have joined the war not against ISIS, but against Bashar al-Assad's regime in Damascus. Israel is not fighting ISIS, it's fighting Syria. So in what sense are they against ISIS? They're actually killing the people who are fighting ISIS. Confused? You might be, but there's no reason to be, because you have to look at the real interests of those who are involved. Let me just take one. Don't want you to think I'm picking on them or anything. Why is Saudi Arabia against Syria? Because it doesn't like one family rule? Excuse me? Saudi Arabia has called its country after one family, who have ruled since the state was formed, and if they can get away with it, will rule for all eternity. So when they tell you they're fighting Syria because it's completely unacceptable that one family can rule Syria for decade after decade, that's clearly absurd, because the Saudi royal family is one family and they are in absolute control of Saudi Arabia. Is it because Syria is a dictatorship, which it is, by the way? Well, that can't be true either, can it? Because Saudi Arabia is the worst dictatorship of them all. Is it because there's no human rights and liberty in Syria? Well, that can't be true, because there's no human rights or liberty in Saudi Arabia at all. So what's the real reason why Saudi Arabia has put itself at the head of a 34-country coalition? Let me debunk that right away. There's no 34-country coalition. The idea that these 34 countries are going to fight terrorism in the Middle East and around the world is ridiculous. They've joined the alliance so Saudi Arabia can give them money. And if they really wanted an alliance, why didn't they invite Iraq and Syria to join their alliance? Why didn't they invite Russia to join their alliance? Because their aims and objectives are entirely different and separate. That's my take, anyway. Do you want to respond to it?
I feel that the way it's framed now is that what's very attractive to conventional news reporting is a binary frame: goodies versus baddies, us versus them. And I think what's happened now is ISIS are the baddies, and that's the way it's been framed. But in all of that, Assad and what he has been doing for many years has sort of been forgotten, and ISIS are now the baddies since Paris, but that's the way the media has framed it. Do you think it's been oversimplified in many ways?
Of course, all things in the mass media are oversimplified. They're reduced to binary choices, a Manichaean competition between good and evil. That would happen anyway, even if there was good intention on the part of the media. ISIS are the baddies. I'm not contesting that point. The point I'm contesting is that the people who are calling them the baddies are the people who've been supporting them for the last 5 years and continue to support them. ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the extremism that they represent are an existential threat not just to the people of Paris or London, but to the Muslims themselves. They're an existential threat to Islam itself. So I'm for fighting them. I'm for stopping the money, the weapons, the propaganda. I mean, there are countries in the Persian Gulf with powerful television stations who for the last 5 years have been endlessly 24/7 supporting this so-called revolution in Syria. And now they want us to believe they're forming an alliance to fight the very people that they have built up. I come from Dundee in Scotland. There was a woman there called Mary Shelley. She wrote a book called Frankenstein. It's a very, very important book, because what's the story of Frankenstein? It is that when you make a monster, it soon breaks free of your control. That's why it's called a monster. Otherwise it wouldn't be a monster. And it isn't that we haven't been here before. Some of us, not you, I'm hasten to add, are old enough to remember the monster we made in Afghanistan throughout the 1980s. We made a monster that became Taliban, became Al-Qaeda, which became ISIS. We made that monster. We gave it money, weapons, propaganda, diplomatic and political support. I said to Margaret Thatcher in the British Parliament, to her face, on the eve of the fall of Kabul, to what became the Taliban, became Al-Qaeda. I said, you have opened the gates of hell for the people of Afghanistan, and a long dark night will now descend upon them. They laughed. Oh, how they laughed. But nobody's laughing now in Afghanistan. Rambo, Sylvester Stallone, Rambo 5. If you get an old copy of it, because they've rubbed it out now, you get an old copy of it, the film is dedicated to the freedom fighters of Afghanistan, who included, of course, Osama bin Laden and all these forces that we now see as a terrifying, horrifying prospect. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher paraded these people on their party conference platforms as freedom fighters. But they weren't freedom fighters. They were the darkest obscurantists wanting to turn human society back to the Stone Age. And they have done in the case of Afghanistan. They have done now in the case of Libya. I was never a supporter of the Libyan dictatorship. But I'll tell you this, for the vast majority of people in Libya, it would have been far better if Gaddafi was still there, rather than what they have now. The people of Iraq would have been far better with Saddam Hussein as their president than what they have now. And the people of Syria are far better with the Assad dictatorship than they would be if ISIS and Al-Qaeda were ruling their countries. I believe these truths to be self-evident. You, sir.
My name is Abdullah Hamuda. I am a writer and journalist. يعني أعتقد أن القضية لها جانب عالمي أكثر منه إقليمي. عندما عمل الغرب على عولمة الاقتصاد والسياسة والثقافة والإعلام، نسوا أنهم وهم يعملون ذلك يقدمون أيضا على عولمة الإرهاب، بحيث أن العالم عندما يصبح قرية كونية ما يحدث في أي منطقة يحدث في مناطق أخرى. ومن ذلك أن التعليم بشكل غسل المخ والتلقين يخلق عقلا جامدا مهيئا لكي يكون خامة للإرهاب. ولكن أولئك الذين يعملون في منطقة الشرق الأوسط ويبنون الشخصية الإرهابية بشكل ما لا يعملون وحدهم، وأنهم يعملون في إطار سياسات خارجية للقوى الغالبة في العالم اليوم. وإذا لم تأمرهم تلك القوى الغالبة لن يتحركوا في هذا السياق. وهذا يعني يجعل من الضروري مناقشة السياسة الغربية. هل السياسة الغربية كانت صادقة بالنسبة للتعددية الثقافية؟ هل لديها سياسة لدمج المسلمين في المجتمع مع المحافظة على الهوية كمكون في المجتمع ككل؟ ألم يشجعوا الإرهاب باستخدام حقوق الإنسان لقبول لاجئين هم نفسهم يعني يجب التحقق من هويتهم بالفعل، لأنهم كمغتربين هنا يتقاربون مع ناس يعانون من اغترابا في مجتمعهم هنا في بريطانيا وفي الدول الغربية، وهذا يخلق مشاكل. وإذا جئنا إلى قضية داعش على سبيل المثال، ألم تصمت الحكومات الغربية وتغمض عينها عن ذهاب كثيرين إلى منطقة الشرق الأوسط للانضمام إلى داعش على أمل أنهم سيقتلون على يد غيرهم ولن يعودوا، وإذا بها تفاجأ أنهم يعودون وقد أصبحوا أكثر تطرفا وأكثر استعدادا للهجمات في الغرب.
Well, that's too extraordinarily powerful an intervention to deal with in the time that I have left in this first segment. I make this caveat, much of what you said I agreed with. If there are some Muslims who came here to cause problems, and there are, it's definitely not as many of us that went there to cause far bigger problems. 53 people were murdered by this mindset in London on 7/7/2005. That's a quiet afternoon in the Arab and Muslim world compared to the death and destruction that we bring to them. So we have to keep this in some perspective. There's 55 killed in Syria every day. Certainly Syria and Iraq together, 55 and many more than 55. Being killed by people that we have been supporting and that we have helped to make strong enough to kill the 55. I believe, and you implicitly agree with this, that if we all stayed out of Syria, cut off the weapons flow, cut off the oil sales, seized the money, that Russia and the Syrian army would finish this war in a few weeks. There would still be an extant problem of individual acts of terrorism, still be a bomb here and there. But the situation where half of Syria is controlled by these people, half of the territory of Syria, this would be finished very quickly. And it's precisely to stop it being finished very quickly that Britain and France and the United States have become involved. It's because they don't want it to be finished. Because if it's finished and Bashar is still the president, they have lost. And all the investment that they have made in this is lost. But I'll develop further my arguments responding to yours after this. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, but dealing with truly global events. The challenge of ISIS and the motives and the intentions of those who say they've set themselves up now to fight it. Before the break, we had a very important contribution that I only partly answered. I want to answer just one other part of what you've said, just so that we can get as many people as possible in. You said, sir, that people had been fed a kind of sense of grievance over generations, which just needed an ignition. I wouldn't myself put it that way. I would say that the Western Sykes-Picot division of the Arab world at the end of the First World War is ingredient number one. The fake, false division of the Arabs into hitherto non-existing states and the placing on the thrones, later the presidential chairs of those fake states was deliberately done in the selfish self-interest of the then imperial powers, Britain and France. That's why they did it. It wasn't a love of geography or the drawing of straight lines on maps. It was, we'll divide the Arabs, we'll set them against each other, we'll imbue them with fake, petty nationalism, we will rob them of any sense of Arabism from them, any sense that they could be a united people from the Atlantic to the Gulf. We'll make them be prepared to live and even die and even kill for flags, which we shall now give them. That's contribution number one. Contribution number two, the implantation of the Zionist state in the area, in the service of those same imperial powers. That'll help keep the Arabs nice and divided, nice and weak, and that will allow us to continue to plunder them. Then the determination of imperialism, later imperialism, into the 1950s I'm going now, to defeat the idea of Arab unity. And in particular, to make it impossible for the greatest of all the Arab leaders, in my opinion, Gamal Abdel Nasser, to unite the Arabs. So how do we do that? Well, there are many ways, but one of them is to help create a sense of not Arab unity, but Islamism. So we will help bring about a Muslim brotherhood whose principal aim will be not actually the interests of the Muslims, but opposition to Arab nationalism and the policies of Nasser. We will try to divide the nationalists between the Baathists and the Nasserists. We will try to weaken the communists and the socialists. And one by one, all of these alternative paths, routes that the Arabs could have taken were closed off and became failures. Of course, the people involved, the nationalists, the Baathists, the communists, the socialists, they didn't need much help to fail. They were plenty able to fail themselves, but just in case, we helped them to fail. What did that leave? If nationalism is a busted flush, socialism, communism, every kind of ism is a busted flush, what does that leave? Only leaves Islamism, doesn't it? And that Islamism can be extremized, fanaticized, according to taste, in the hope that, like Dr. Frankenstein, you can control the monster. Now we're finding out that you can't. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, George. My name's Tony Gosling. I'm an investigative journalist. Back during 1990, the first Gulf War, I was working in one of the BBC's main newsrooms in London as a researcher, and I invited on to the radio to speak a man who was a biographer of Saddam Hussein. He was actually quite a fan of Saddam Hussein because I believed that that's the only way that a good broadcasting service should operate, where you've got people on both sides of a conflict and putting both points of view. The man was extremely interesting, very good. He was actually saying that Saddam had done quite a lot of good things for Iraq, but this wasn't the right story. I was told this in no uncertain terms by one of the producers there. Tony, that's the wrong story. And this kind of thing I find rather disappointing, that actually when you're trying to do balance, you're told that kind of thing. And I think we've seen that increase in spades since the first Gulf War, through 9/11, etc., where there is really a one-sided view given by the mainstream media. The BBC does its best because it's under assault from the Conservative government here and from the Rupert Murdoch empire, and it's probably the only reasonably balanced views we've got left. But I would point to things like the Ghouta chemical weapons attack 2 years ago. It now looks, according at least to Seymour Hersh and Carla Del Ponte from the United Nations, as if the chemical weapons actually came through Turkey. I would also point to the influence of Erdogan's son, Bilal Erdogan, in Turkey as profiteering from the oil that he's buying from ISIS across the porous border between Syria and Turkey. These, of course, are the wrong stories, and exactly now the same sort of thing happening. I would also point, George, to the attacks in Paris, which are being used to justify apparently Britain's involvement and Britain's self-defence, and also to things like the San Bernardino shootings recently in the United States. There have been some very important questions raised, often through social media and blogs about these attacks, because often what we're being told by the mainstream press isn't even necessarily true. The other thing is that police are now often shooting to kill suspects, so there's no judicial process. I would point now then to the Operation Gladio, which NATO was conducting throughout the 1970s and 1980s in Europe, where they were using special forces to kill ordinary innocent Europeans in places like Italy, in Belgium, and in Germany, in order to influence foreign policy. For example, in Belgium, there was a vote in the National Parliament against having American cruise missiles in Belgium. They said quite rightly that this makes us a target for Russian ballistic missiles. We don't want cruise missiles. All of a sudden there were attacks in supermarkets. Many people, something like 60 or 70 people, innocent people, killed. Now we know, because there's been a parliamentary inquiry in Belgium, that these were actually special forces, possibly even SAS from Britain, that did these killings. And I wonder, George, do you think the same sort of thing is going on now? We've got another kind of Operation Gladio, where NATO, not the British Army, but NATO intelligence in Brussels, is using special forces, involving them in some of these attacks.
I don't. Neither do I embrace all of the theories that you outlined. Not because I think that our rulers are too moral to carry out such things, but because I think they're too stupid to do so without being caught. I think that the Gladio operation and many other false flags and dirty tricks operations are real. I don't necessarily endorse the Belgian story that you told, but I do think that our rulers are prepared to lie and cheat and, yes, kill us into exactly the course of action that they want us to be herded into. So we'll have to defer a discussion on the nuts and bolts of that for another day, but I am in no doubt at all that the political class and the mass media, owned as it is either by privateers, buccaneers like Rupert Murdoch, are definitely hand in hand in a conspiracy to turn the nation down a certain path. Let's see from the voice of the people how well it's working. We took the Al Mayadeen cameras out onto the streets of London to ask some of these questions. Take a look at this.
What do you think of UK starting airstrike in Syria?
Well, I don't think I should have an opinion on that. I think it's irrelevant to have an opinion on that. It's not we decide, it's the parliament decide mostly.
I think that airstrikes may not be more efficient than ground attacks. So we do, I believe that the UK do send troops to fight ISIS in Syria as well. And I think for ground troops, it will create less casualties for Syrian civilians.
The question should be really is not around about ISIS, but what about the people of Syria, what about the people of Iraq, and how are we helping them, and helping them against people like ISIS who are taking away their freedom, their liberty and their right to actually learn and everything else like that.
What do you think of UK starting airstrike in Syria?
I'm against these airstrikes because, I mean, you had violence that caused the wars in the first place. I mean, the bombing in Afghanistan and Iraq, it only created more fringe terrorism. State terrorism leads to fringe terrorism, and more airstrikes and bombings are only going to lead to more angry, marginalized people.
I don't think so, because if you bomb one place, another place could start and rebel and do the exact same thing.
If we don't bomb them, they're going to get a bit stronger probably.
Blimey, the only person talking sense was an American. You see how well the propaganda has worked? People accept your word, the framing of the question, almost blindly. Nobody said, wait a minute, it was our invasion and occupation of Iraq which created ISIS in the first place. It was our invasion of Afghanistan. It was our building up of these extremists throughout the 1980s in Afghanistan. Nobody said any of that context. The best they were prepared to do was discuss whether we should send somebody else's son as a ground troop to go and get killed in Syria. Well, I'm here to tell you, I have 3 sons, and none of them are going as ground troops to give their life's blood in Syria. You'd have to kill me first before any of my sons would be allowed to go and give their life's blood in Syria. This is a kind of madness, where the actual dichotomy, polarization, the actual question is whether we bomb or whether we send ground troops. I found that quite demoralizing, that set of vox pops. What about you, Tony?
Yes, I totally agree. And I think one of the points which hasn't come out, which is actually the most important in many ways, is that if we look at history, for example, the shoot-to-kill policy by the British government in Northern Ireland, if we look at the bombing of Cambodia by the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Henry Kissinger, that actually this kind of unjust bombing, indiscriminate bombing of civilians, which this is bound to turn into to a certain extent, is actually the greatest recruiting tool for ISIS possible. So what they're doing is utterly counterproductive. I'm very disappointed, George, that we didn't hear you in the House of Commons making some of these points, because it seemed that the MPs, the British MPs, were incredibly badly briefed by the Joint Intelligence Committee, who I think probably should all get the sack.
Well, we have a political class and a media class which has no historical memory. It's not necessarily the case that it's willful. It's that they don't know, they think a story starts when the BBC and Sky News turn up. They don't know that this story has been years, decades, maybe centuries in the making. They are what Dennis Healy, God rest his soul, once described as teenage scribblers. They may not be teenagers, but they might as well be, because of the total lack of awareness and knowledge of how we got here. How often do you hear in the Western media about the history of our colonizing of these places? Who knows in Britain that Britain and France together were the colonial power in Syria? We ruled it. Our flag flew over it. Who knows in the Western world the history of Iraq, how the boundary of Iraq came to be drawn, how Kuwait was carved out of Iraq for our own selfish purposes of exploiting its oil resources and depriving Iraq of them. I mean, I could go on all night, but then nobody else in the audience would get a look in. I'll be right back after this. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, but discussing a problem that's accelerating in its orbit of the whole world. We're talking about ISIS and the fight against it. We took the cameras out throughout the city centre in London. Let's hear this set of Vox Populi.
And do you think that the UK government or the Western countries should boycott those who financially support ISIS, like Saudi, Qatar?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we should, maybe boycotting isn't the right word, but we definitely need to talk to them, like Turkey with letting them through the borders, and yeah, with Saudi Arabia as well.
The West should boycott. Everyone should boycott them. The rhetoric between West and the East, it's not productive now. It's just like making problems worse. I think we all should have a real discussion, who is doing what, and just isolate them.
The Western countries are really working to defeat ISIS.
No, I feel like right now everyone's scared and just doing everything in their best national interest. I don't think their Muslim countries right now are maximizing their capabilities in fighting this. I think they want to stay out of it as much as possible and just not get their hands dirty.
Well, there are always room for improvement, I should say, but it's not only in developed countries. Developing countries should join too.
There should be some form of action taken against those countries that are actually actively supporting them, but you've got to prove it.
God help us. That's the voice of the people in the university area of SOAS. Let's hear some more sense from the audience here. Yes, the gentleman at the back.
Hi, I'm Mohan. I'm a student. And I was wondering, for the younger generation, according to the media, you see kids and teenagers joining the so-called fight in Syria. I was just wondering, what do you think motivates the younger generation to go all the way to Syria and the ISIS-occupied countries and to join the fight?
Well, I wish I knew the complete answer to that. It will partly be what our distinguished expert talked about at the beginning. the sense of grievance, which has grown and grown. I tried to adumbrate the ingredients of that grievance: colonialism, Islamophobia in Western countries, the ability to watch the television news. I mean, they're always looking for a cleric to ban or an Islamist organization to proscribe to combat radicalization. But actually, the ability to watch the news kind of makes you feel a bit radical. When you see the treatment of the Palestinian people, for example, under Israeli occupation, which is assisted from A to Z by Western countries, and you are growing up in a Western country and you're a Muslim and you feel some consanguinity with the Palestinians under occupation, you feel pretty radical, I think. You feel angry. And you feel angry at the people that are making it all possible. That's another piece of the grievance. There are other problems that are less easy to talk about, but which are undoubtedly present in this. I'm not sure you'll all agree with me on this, but I believe that there is, in a part of the Muslim Ummah, a kind of sickness, a kind of extremism, hatred, sectarian bitterness, which has metastasized over decades into a feeling that you must disrespect other people's religions. You must be ready to cut the heads off people, even in your own religion, if they disagree with you on this or that nuance at the margin of your own faith and even your own sect within that faith. There is terrorism. It exists. It's not invented. It's not Gladio. It's not the British government that are doing it themselves. It's not the French government that are doing it themselves. These French people who murdered, French and Belgian people who murdered 130 plus other French people and others in Paris a few weeks ago, they're not an invention, they really existed. The massacre of Shiites in Pakistan in regular bomb attacks and suicide attacks, the massacre of people in Nigeria, and so these are not inventions, they are being carried out, and they're being carried out by people who consider themselves to be Muslims. And if we deny that, we're living in denial. The one other difference I had with the contribution that was made from the front by Abdullah is this, that there is a tendency, you know, amongst the Arabs and amongst the Muslims as a whole to blame everything on everybody else, to blame the foreigners, to blame the Israelis, to blame the Americans, the British, the French, as if the Arabs and the Muslims were infants, not in control of their own actions, not in control of their own destiny. This is a deeply troubling and deeply dangerous mindset. There are other peripheral points. You might laugh at some of them. Some of these extremists go from Britain, France, Belgium because they think they'll get a wife. And because they can't afford to have a wife here, because they can't have a house here, because they can't afford a house. They think if they go to Syria or Iraq, they'll find a wife and that they can keep that wife and that they can be happy. Some of them are nothing here and want to be something there. Some of them think that if you strap yourselves up with ammunition and carry a big gun, that it makes you a man, that it makes you a better man. And one minute you are a waiter in a restaurant in so-and-so, and now you're a military guy that everybody in the world appears to be terrified of. These are all smaller contributory tributaries feeding into this river of blood that's flowing, but I believe they exist, and I'm not going to deny them. Who else would like to speak? Yes, madam.
Hi, my name is Shima. I'm a student. There is this question in my mind. over these days. It's why doesn't ISIS just go to Israel, and why they don't fight with them? Why it's just with other people like French people or Muslims in other parts of the universal? Why it's not in Israel? Why they don't fight with them?
Well, that's the 64,000 shekel question. There are different explanations for this, each of which can be true, and all of which can be true. Let me take the most banal. It's not a very banal point, but it's the most banal. These people like soft targets. They like to pump lead into people who can't fight them back. So it's very much easier. I've never quite understood it because they are suicide merchants. They do intend to die, which would mean you could fight anybody. You could attack the hardest target. But they don't. They prefer to go to a restaurant and massacre a lot of people, none of whom have weapons, none of whom can fight them back. That's the sickening truth. People talk about their logistics and their planning. It's one of the justifications for bombing Raqqa, because a lot of innocent, unarmed people got murdered in a restaurant in Paris. None of the weapons used in the attack on the restaurants came from Raqqa. You don't need any logistics. You just need the psychotic mentality that somehow God will approve you massacring innocent diners in a restaurant or dancers in a concert hall. You only need the weapon. The weapon didn't come from Syria. As a matter of fact, some of the weapons used in Paris came from the United States. But shh, that would raise the question of American gun laws and how they ended up in Paris. But none of them came from Syria. Nobody's sitting in Raqqa with the street map of Paris deciding that the Bataclan Theatre or Chez Pierre's restaurant should be assailed and everyone in it murdered. That's just ridiculous. This operation was organized in France, and if not in France, then in Belgium. A more sinister explanation would be, well, maybe ISIS has no gripe with Israel. Maybe Israel has helped somehow the development of this extremist phenomenon, and therefore has the right to demand that its people and its territory are not attacked. I don't know the answer to that. But I would say that there are some things that are unarguable. It is unarguable that Israel is bombing those who are fighting ISIS. It is unarguable, it appears in their own newspapers, they're proud of it, that they are treating these fanatic extremists when they cross over the Golan Heights into Israeli-occupied territory. They're treating them in their hospitals, in their field hospitals. And then instead of jailing them for 99 years, like they would with a Palestinian kid who threw a stone at them, they send them back to the battlefield in Syria. That's unarguable. That's a matter of demonstrable fact. It is unarguable that Israel, for some reason, has decided that the fall of the Assad regime in Damascus is a major policy goal for them, even if it means that instead of Assad, you have al-Baghdadi, the caliph, and the black flag of ISIS flying over the capital city of the country next door. Now that's pretty peculiar to me. Isn't Israel so obsessed by security, it's ready to murder 500 children in their beds in Gaza, just in case they grow up to throw a rock at them? But you're unconcerned that the black flag of ISIS might fly in the capital of the next door country? That doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, I'm not one of life's conspiracy theorists. In fact, conspiracy theorists really hate me. They call me a gatekeeper and all kinds of insults. But I don't think you have to be much of a conspiracy theorist to be extremely puzzled that ISIS never attacks Israel and Israel never attacks ISIS. Call me a conspiracy theorist on that one, if you like. Who else would like to make a contribution before the break?
I just wanted to come back to the media, which is sort of my area. I disagree with what you're saying about it. You said it, you know, there's a conspiracy. I think that is something that a lot of people believe, but I think that as a journalist and also as someone who's researched this and looked into this and done empirical research into it, I think that so often it's subconscious. That, for example, you know, as a journalist, you may not pitch an idea that you know won't get a go-ahead in an editorial meeting. Or, you know, so journalists can help build an official narrative around a conflict, and that certainly happened in Northern Ireland. But I think largely it is subconscious. And I also think sometimes that happens just simply because of the norms and the conventions of journalism and how conflicts are reported on TV in particular. You know, there's a convention that the BBC, ITV, various people will always go to an official source. But sometimes that official source is an actor themselves in the conflict. We saw that in Northern Ireland, where there was always an official version of events from, you know, the Ministry of Defence spokesperson or police, but they were part of the conflict. So I think often it's the conventions and the norms of journalism that create this, that build an official narrative. But I do agree with you when you said about the institutional memory. You were talking about the political classes, but I would add to that and say that the journalism doesn't really have a good institutional memory. I mean, the military, for example, will sort of deconstruct every operation and learn from it, and then they'll write manuals about what went wrong, what went well. Whereas journalism doesn't do that. They don't reflect back on, you know, how they reported a war and how it had an impact. Would you agree with that?
Well, I've got so much to say in response to you. I'm going to have to postpone it until after this break. But I just say this as a teaser. Dr. Johnson, the great English man of letters, said, "There is no dictatorship so grim as the dictatorship of the prevailing orthodoxy." And you're working within the prison, never mind the prism, of a prevailing orthodoxy, which I shall describe right after this. We're watching Kalimahoura with me, George Galloway, for Al Mayadeen Television, talking about ISIS and the fight against them. Who's doing it? What are their real intentions? And how come Israel and ISIS have never as much as exchanged the throwing of stones? The lady journalist and academic before the break raised some important points, part of which I have addressed in a kind of metaphor. Let me do so more specifically. Your prevailing orthodoxy leads you to call it Northern Ireland. I don't call it Northern Ireland. I call it the north of Ireland. Because for me, Northern Ireland is British occupied territory in Ireland. Occupied by force, retained by force, and by gerrymandering, the drawing of fake boundaries, severing of the county of Ulster, and so on. Now, I'm not asking you whether you share that view or not. That will depend on which football team you support and which school you went to. And you now know which football team I support and which school I went to, just by me saying that. This is an example of prevailing orthodoxy. You see, the mass media reported the conflict in the north of Ireland according to which prevailing orthodoxy they were located in. If you believe that there is a place called Northern Ireland, if you believe that there's any legitimacy of Northern Ireland being part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, then ipso facto you will believe any armed challenge to that prevailing orthodoxy is illegitimate, is terrorist, etc., etc. But if you don't believe that, as I don't believe it, then you approach it from an entirely different point of view. To use a colloquialism, it depends which side of the telescope you're looking through. Now, there are some overlaps. You could believe in Northern Ireland, but be against the police colluding with terrorists to kill lawyers, as happened, as you know, very frequently in the north of Ireland. You can be a unionist and be against that. Equally, you can be a Republican and be against an IRA attack on a pub or a shop which killed innocent civilians and contributed not a jot to the struggle for reunification. So there are overlaps. There are areas where sense can be found, and we now have a process in the north of Ireland which has ended the war, by and large, 99% of the war, and has a political path which I wholly support. But I don't regard the media class and the political class as two different things. You see, as Tony pointed out, as a former BBC employee, if you work for the BBC, you work for the British state. The British state owns the BBC. They're fond, BBC journalists are fond of describing other people as state media. RT, for example, Russian state media. But they never describe themselves as John Smith of the British state media, BBC. This is absurd. We are with the British people, not the British state. And our views are diametrically opposed to the British state. Anyway, I've spoken enough. Let's hear from you.
Hello, my name's Hussein Emre, and I'm a student. And what I wanted to explain was that I watched a couple of videos online about ISIS and how they were formed, and I've also watched a conference of Putin, the president of Russia, and how he states on how it was idealed and how they were built into it. So how Iraq was at war with America and all the other nations. The infrastructures were all demolished, like the hospitals, the bridges. That's when ISIS, as you stated earlier, there were only a couple hundred of them. And when they started getting funds from different organizations, that's when they grew. And that's when they moved to Syria. And what's your idea on this?
Well, I don't think we should overemphasize the issue of funds, or even weapons. When ISIS, which grew out of Al-Qaeda, which even President Obama now, even though Tony Blair doesn't, even President Obama publicly states that Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria, which became ISIS, although there's now both of them there, came directly out of the British and American invasion and occupation of Iraq. The destruction of Iraq, the killing of 1 million of its people, produced this extremism, which was not just predictable, but was predicted, including by me, and including to Tony Blair's face. When they took over the 40% of Iraq that they currently rule, they found lots of banks with lots of money in it, and they looted hundreds of millions of dollars from these banks. They are selling oil on a daily basis worth about $2 million a day. Stolen oil from Iraq and Syria, which is being bought by, it's obvious, being bought by somebody, I'll tell you who, by the son of the president of Turkey. And I'll tell you where he sells it. He sells it to Israel. How's that? ISIS steals oil, sells it to one of the Muslim Brotherhood's leaders' family in Turkey, who sell it to Israel. How's that for peculiar? And I don't mean funny peculiar, I mean tragic peculiar. So they make a lot of money that way. They don't pay for much. They just steal, take whatever they can, whatever is left. And the people who are fighting for them are not fighting for money. There's easier ways to make $100 or $400 a month than going to fight for ISIS. whichever country you're in, there's easier money to be made than that. Equally weapons. They stole a lot of weapons. The Iraqi army threw away a lot of weapons when they were running away, even their uniforms. They have had some weapons from the United States and from Britain and from France, usually indirectly, i.e. the weapons are given to the so-called FSA and then taken from them by ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who are much stronger militarily, with much more fight in them than the FSA, who prefer to spend their time in the hotels in Istanbul. It's much less dangerous. So we shouldn't overemphasize money, we shouldn't overemphasize weapons, but neither should we exaggerate what this armed formation is. It is tops 100,000 fighters. It's actually less, I'm sure, but tops it's 100,000 fighters. And 25,000 of those, minimum, are foreigners who used to work in B&Q or serve hamburgers at McDonald's before they ran away to join the ISIS, to join Al-Qaeda. We're not talking about crack soldiers here. We're not talking about the Royal Marine Commandos. We're not talking about the Navy SEALs. We're not talking about the SAS. We're talking about people who were never soldiers and now have weapons. The Syrian army and the Russians could defeat them in a fortnight if everybody else stayed out, never mind joined in. Go on.
My other question is, did you know that before Saddam Hussein was hanged and Gaddafi was assassinated, that they had an idea to make a bank for Africa, and before they had the bigger banks did not want this to happen. That was the reason why Gaddafi was assassinated and Saddam Hussein was hanged.
No, I'm sorry, that's not true. It's a well-known conspiracy theory, but it's not true. Muammar Gaddafi controlled Libya for 33 years. At the time of his demise, there were only 3 million Libyans living in Libya. Muammar Gaddafi controlled trillions of dollars worth of oil. Every Libyan could and should have been a multi-millionaire. The public realm of Libya could and should have looked like Dubai. It didn't, and they weren't. So don't tell me that Gaddafi fell because he was going to make an African bank or produce a gold dinar. I'm sorry, these are fantasies. The Libyan regime was a catastrophic failure, a catastrophic, disastrous failure. Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party led Iraq for decades, from 1968 until the fall in 2003. They too had trillions of dollars worth of wealth. They did rather better than Gaddafi did. They built rather more than Gaddafi did, but in the end, nobody was prepared to fight and die to defend them because of all the bad things. Saddam Hussein did some good things, but the bad things that he did meant that his regime was indefensible by the end. This I know because I'm an older man than you. Let me take probably the last contribution.
Did you also know that the ISIS leader is, his name's translated to an Israeli name? That I've also picked up from just the internet and other sources I've heard of. And also that when I was watching Putin's video, that it's not just normal ISIS fighters, they're not just normal people. 10%, maybe 5% of them are actual mercenaries that were sent to these countries. And if they were just to be standalone, just normal people, I don't think that they would be able to last this long.
No, I don't agree with that either. Sorry, we just have to agree to differ, and there isn't time left to go through them all. I'm going to my experts to finish the show, starting with you, sir, Abdullah.
دعني أعود إلى نقطة واحدة من ردك على ما قلته في بداية البرنامج، وهي تلك المتعلقة برفضك لأن العرب يلقون باللائمة في قصورهم على الآخرين. في حقيقة الأمر أن هذا صحيح، العرب يلقون باللائمة في قصورهم على الآخرين، ولكنهم يعانون على مدى سنوات طويلة من نوع من الحرب التي تؤدي إلى خلق حالة من الخواء الإنساني لديهم، وهذه الحالة تجعلهم ضعافا لا يستطيعون أن يواجهوا غيرهم وأن يقفوا في موقف مواجهة يحقق للذات الاحترام. ما تقوله أنت صحيح وما قلته أنا صحيح، ولكن اثنين صحيحين لا يجعلان موقفا صحيحا بالضرورة.
I've been with the Arabs more than 40 years. Nobody could be closer to the Arabs and their persona than me. From the outside, I mean. It's not congenital. Syed Hassan Nasrallah is an Arab. Faris O'Day was an Arab. The Intifada are Arabs. The Iraqi resistance against British and American invasion, they were Arabs. The Syrian Arab army are Arabs. So it's not congenital, but it is pervasive. I once told a young lady, it became a famous YouTube hit with millions and millions of hits, who said to me, the West will never allow us to be united. America will never allow us to be united, Sunni and Shia. I told her the Americans can't control Brooklyn. They can't control what's happening in Brooklyn. Never mind control whether you can talk and link up with your Sunni neighbor or your Shiite neighbor in Lebanon. If you decide that you are going to, nothing on earth can stand against you. That's a good way to end the show. That you were right and I was right, but both of our rights don't make it right. Kalima hurra means in English a free word. We've exchanged quite a few of those free words this evening, and I hope everyone has enjoyed the experience and enjoyed the show. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kalima hurra for Al Mayadeen Television in London.